If you want a litmus test on how good the Seahawks front office is doing, take a look at the linebackers in 2020. That's kind of how I feel right now when I'm looking at this roster. Obviously, the front office is responsible for everything on this team and everything needs to be monitored, but I feel like a huge chunk of deciding whether or not the front office has been getting things right lately can be determined by what the linebackers do in 2020, because we have made some significant decisions at that position lately, and those decisions paying off are crucial to our 2020 season and crucial for the future of this front office. The most obvious one, and the one I think everybody would agree with me on, would be Jordan Brooks, the mystifying, confusing, shocking first-round pick of the Seahawks in the most recent draft. Is he going to be good? Is he going to get on the field enough? Can he help the team win in 2020? The answer to those questions is going to go a long way towards determining how good this front office is performing. KJ Wright, a player who we very reasonably could have moved on from this offseason, could have cut him to save big money, could have put that money towards something else. We didn't do it. We're keeping him around for one more year in all likelihood. Can he live up to his big salary? Can he live up to his reputation as a great linebacker? Does he have one more good season in him? Are we going to regret giving him all that money for his 10th season? The answer to those questions is going to also come back to the front office. And if it goes right, we can praise the front office. But if it doesn't go right, they need to own that. And then you have Cody Barton, a guy who's almost forgotten right now. Cody Barton, with a couple of decisions that the team has made this offseason, has gone from a guy who I honestly expected to start in 2020, quite possibly getting almost 100% of the snaps in the KJ Wright role, to a guy who I don't even think is going to play on defense until somebody gets hurt. So his progression and his development as a player in the NFL has been significantly deprioritized and pushed back. Are we going to regret that? Are we going to wish that we had found out more about Cody Barton this year instead of pushing it back to 2021, if not even later than that? Is it good to take a third-round linebacker in the draft and then basically redshirt him for 2 straight years? How we feel about that by the end of this season is going to also go a long way towards our feelings on the front office. But there's one more linebacker on this team that needs to be discussed, and that is the man himself, one of the greatest Seahawks of all time, future Hall of Famer, many-time Pro Bowler, many-time All-Pro, Bobby Wagner. And there's the conventional wisdom about Bobby Wagner and what he did last year. But I had some questions. I had some questions about the way he played in 2019, and I have some concerns about how it affects us going forward, because Bobby Wagner very recently, not even a year ago, signed a monster extension. And that extension has not even gone into effect yet. It goes into effect this year. So understanding what Bobby did last year, how valuable he actually was, how good he actually was, and the sustainability of making Bobby Wagner one of your highest paid players needs to be called into question going into this season. So in this video, I'm going to take a close look, a deep dive into Bobby Wagner's 2019 season, and from that, we're going to try to determine what we need to see from him in 2020 if we're not going to cripple this team's cap going forward. Before we get into my deep dive into Bobby Wagner's 2019 season, let's take a look at the elephant in the room, Bobby Wagner's contract with the Seattle Seahawks. As of right now, it has 3 years left on it, running through the 2022 season. In 2020, he makes just shy of $15 million, and the dead cap hit for cutting him would be $22 million. So we don't have to concern ourselves with that. Here's where things get tricky, though. In 2021, Bobby Wagner's cap hit will be just over $17 million, and the dead cap hit for cutting him would be a still painful, but nevertheless possible $7.5 million. And in 2022, the final year of his current deal, he takes a cap hit of over $20 million with a dead cap hit, if cut, of just under $4 million. Far more manageable, far more reasonable. When the Seahawks gave Bobby Wagner his extension, I'm pretty sure that was the plan. let him play through 2021, and then cut him before the 2022 season, taking on only the $3.75 million cap hit. But what if we have to let go of Bobby sooner? Remember, dead cap money does roll over from season to season. So cutting Bobby Wagner after 2020 would mean that the team would have to absorb a cap hit of more than $11 million over the next 2 years combined. Now, I know this is the part where everybody goes, why are you concerned about Bobby Wagner? He led the league in tackles last year. He made first team All-Pro last year. He's not going anywhere anytime soon. Why is this on your mind? Well, in order to answer that question, we need to do some deep diving into some advanced metrics and analytics. First, I made a list of Bobby Wagner's current peers in the NFL. And when I say a peer, it means somebody who does roughly the same stuff on a football field that Bobby Wagner does. Ultimately, I made a list of 18 players who fulfilled my criteria. Criteria number 1, you had to play middle linebacker in a 4-3 or inside linebacker in a 3-4 in 2019. Criteria number 2, you had to have at least 100 total tackles in the 2019 regular season. These are the players we are going to be comparing Bobby Wagner to as we move forward in this video. Our 18 players are Blake Martinez, Jordan Hicks, Luke Kuechly, Zach Cunningham, Jalen Smith, Todd Davis, Corey Littleton, Joe Schobert, Anthony Walker, Levante David, Fred Warner, Tremaine Edmonds, Rashaan Evans, Eric Kendricks, Devin Bush, John Bostic, Jayon Brown, and Roquan Smith. So anyway, I started my deep dive off at the surface. What were some things about Bobby Wagner that I could say without doing a ton of research? What are some things about Bobby Wagner in 2019 that are fairly obvious? In order to break this down, we're going to go through a list I made of 2019 pros, 2019 mez, and 2019 cons for Bobby. Let's start with the pros. Pro number 1, Bobby Wagner had 159 tackles in 2019. That was first in the entire NFL, not only for his peers, but for the entire league. Pro number 2, Bobby Wagner managed to tally up 3 sacks in 2019. And compared to the other interior linebackers in 2019, that was actually a really good total. In fact, I could only find one of his peers who had more in 2019, Corey Littleton, who came in at 3.5. Pro number 3, Bobby Wagner missed only 10 tackles in 2019, or 5.9% of his tackle opportunities. I did find 4 of his peers who actually had fewer missed tackles and a lower missed tackle rate in 2019, but Bobby was still 5th, which is pretty darn good. Pro number 4 is pretty obvious, and I think everybody knows this one, and it doesn't even necessarily say all that much by itself, but Bobby did make first team All-Pro. And don't get me wrong, I am under no impression that the NFL is in the habit of giving out All-Pro selections to players who are just bad. Our 5th and final pro has to do with the defense as a whole. In 2019, the Seattle Seahawks defense forced 32 turnovers, which was the 3rd best total in the NFL. So Bobby Wagner was the captain and leader for a defense that managed to take the ball away a lot. So now let's do our mez. These are things where Bobby Wagner was okay, not great, maybe not even good, and it's a little concerning, but I wouldn't exactly call it alarming. Meh number 1. Even though Bobby Wagner led the league in tackles, when you looked at just his solo tackles, it painted a far less pretty picture. His 86 solo tackles in 2019 were not even top 5 among his peers. Again, this is not something to be alarmed about, but it is notable when you compare him to similar players. Men number 2 are quarterback pressures. Bobby Wagner had 6 quarterback pressures in 2019. A pressure, by the way, is your sacks plus your QB hits plus your QB hurries over the course of the year. I found 6 interior linebackers who had more than Bobby's 6 in 2019. I'm not overly concerned about this because, with one exception, all of the middle linebackers who had more QB pressures than Bobby had 1 more, but it is a fairly unremarkable number all the same. Now time for meh number 3, TFLs, or if you prefer, tackles for loss. Bobby Wagner had 8 of them in 2019. which is kind of low given that he led the whole NFL in total tackles. In fact, I found 7 interior linebackers who had more than Bobby's 8. That being said, most of them only had a couple more. So again, nothing to rip your hair out about. Man number 4, we have turnovers. And I know you're asking, what are turnovers for a linebacker? Well, it's a stat I just made up. It's your interceptions plus your forced fumbles plus your fumble recoveries, trying to encapsulate how good you were at taking the ball away in one useful stat. Bobby Wagner had 3 total turnovers forced in 2019. And it's not really that great of a total when you look around the league. In fact, I found 8 interior linebackers in 2019 who had more than 3. And our 5th and final meh for Bobby Wagner in 2019 would be some of his work in pass coverage. In 2019, Wagner had 6 passes defensed. This did not compare very well to some of the other great middle linebackers in the NFL right now. He did make the top 10, but just barely. I found 9 interior linebackers who had more pass defenses than Bobby in 2019. None of that stuff is great. In fact, it's not even good. But I'm not really concerned about any of those things. Those statistics in particular are often sporadic from year to year and tend to be kind of random. So I'm not saying we need to kick Bobby Wagner out anytime soon because of anything I just went over. It's what I'm going to go over next that really has me concerned. The cons for Bobby Wagner in 2019 are actually really simple. They all have to do with the overall performance of the defense over the course of that season. In 2019, the Seahawks allowed 398 points, which was 22nd in the NFL. They also allowed 6,106 total yards, 26th in the NFL out of 32 teams. They allowed 4,223 passing yards, which was 27th in the league, and 1,883 rushing yards, 22nd. Finally, and maybe the most alarming given who we're talking about here, we gave up 4.9 yards per rushing attempt, 28th in the NFL. So in short, Bobby Wagner was the captain, the leader, and the highest paid player on a defense that was bad. Not average, not a little below average, not mediocre, not decent, bad. And you can pin that on many different people who are not Bobby Wagner all you want to. And I'll even agree with you for most of it. But at the end of the day, Bobby Wagner's defense was bad. And he needs to own at least a part of that. Now it's time for a deep dive into Bobby to try to really understand what's going on here. He's only one of our most important players and our second highest paid player, so we do need to figure this out, and the sooner we can figure it out, the better. Let's start with pass defense, since all of these stats are pretty easy to get. They're all readily available on ProFootballReference.com. Shout out to them for providing a very useful and easy to use table of statistics for all NFL players. So let's take a look at these numbers. And as we do, keep in mind that Bobby Wagner is being compared to a list of players that is 18 entries long. First, let's take a look at targets. This is the number of times an opposing quarterback threw the ball to a receiver that Bobby Wagner was covering at the time the pass was thrown. All in all, Bobby was targeted in coverage 72 times in 2019. I compared this to the other interior linebackers who I listed earlier, and Bobby Wagner ranked 14th. There were 13 linebackers on the list who had fewer targets in coverage than Bobby. So it seems like Bobby got picked on a little bit. Next up, we have completions. This is pretty self-explanatory. It's the number of completions that a player gave up in coverage. Bobby Wagner gave up 58 completions in 2019. And compared to the other inside linebackers who we listed before, that's 16th. So we have 15 players who have a similar role to Bobby Wagner who gave up fewer completions in 2019. Given those two stats, it's no surprise that Bobby Wagner's completion percentage allowed in 2019 is bad, and boy howdy, is it ever. Bobby Wagner allowed a completion on 80.6% of the targets thrown his way. I could only find 2 linebackers who play similar to Bobby Wagner who gave up a higher completion percentage. Bobby ranks 17th out of 19. But wait, it gets worse. What about the number of passing yards he allowed in coverage? Well, Bobby gave up 657 yards in coverage last year, and I compared him to every single other high tackle middle linebacker in the NFL, all 18 players that I went over above. And Bobby Wagner had given up more yards than all of them. Bobby Wagner ranked 19 out of 19 in passing yards allowed in 2019. Next up, we have yards per completion. This is, of course, the number of yards that a player allows per completed pass. Bobby does a little better here, but not a lot. 11.3 yards per completion is still on the low end. As we can see here, he ranks 17th out of 19 qualifying middle linebackers. And naturally, his yards allowed per target is not better. In fact, it's actually a little worse. Bobby Wagner allows 9.1 yards per target in 2019 in coverage. That is 18th. I could find only one qualifying middle linebacker who was worse than Bobby's 9.1. Next up, we have touchdowns allowed. Finally, we find a stat that kind of makes Bobby Wagner look good. Bobby Wagner allowed 2 touchdowns in coverage in 2019, which was more or less the same number of touchdowns allowed as most of the linebackers on this list. I was able to find 6 who allowed either 0 or 1, putting Bobby Wagner tied for 7th with a whole bunch of people. That certainly is better than most of the stuff we've been looking at recently. Unfortunately, we go right back into the pit of misery with our next stat, passer rating. What kind of passer rating did Bobby Wagner allow on targets to the man he was covering? 108.2. And yes, I compared this to everyone else, and I could only find one comparable linebacker who was worse. Bobby Wagner ranks 18th out of 19. Next up, we have a stat that actually makes Bobby look okay. DADOT. Yeah, I'm probably going to have to explain that one, right? DADOT is average depth of target. Basically, this looks at what kind of passes is a player giving up. Are they short passes or are they down the field? Average depth of target measures how far down the field the receiver was when he was targeted by a quarterback's throw. Bobby Wagner's 3.9 yards of average target depth was 8th of the 19 players listed above. Pretty good, not special necessarily, but one of the few stats here that actually makes him look pretty good. We're almost done. Next is air yards. To get air yards, you basically would take DADOT and multiply it by the number of completions a player allowed. Bobby Wagner's 229 air yards allowed did not really stack up with these other players. He ranked 15th. But even uglier than that might be the 428 yards after the catch that Bobby Wagner allowed in 2019. When receivers were catching passes while covered by Bobby, they were breaking off big plays after catching it over and over. And that is reflected very well in the fact that Bobby's yards after the catch score was 19th out of 19 middle linebackers. One last stat before we move on from pass defense, because I want to try to capture as much data as possible here. Pass rush win percentage. In order to get this stat, I took every time a player blitzed on a defensive play and added in how many times their blitz was successful. So basically, if a player blitzed 50 times in the course of a season and was able to get either a QB hurry, QB knockdown, or sack on 10 of those plays, then their pass rush win percentage would be 20% because their pass rush worked 20% of the time. Bobby Wagner actually did quite a bit of blitzing in 2019. In fact, according to Pro Football Reference, he blitzed 71 times, and he only got home on 6 of those blitzes for a pass rush win percentage of 8.5%. This stacks up pretty poorly compared to the other top middle linebackers in the game. Out of 19, Bobby Wagner's 8.5% ranked 16th. Put it all together, you can make a pretty strong argument that Bobby Wagner was the worst of the 19 middle linebackers we've gone over in this video when it came to defending the pass. Now, don't get me wrong, it's pretty easy to write off a lot of this stuff as not being Bobby Wagner's fault. Quite honestly, I write a lot of it off as not being Bobby Wagner's fault. The reasons why this might be the case are pretty obvious. The Seahawks had one of the worst pass rushes in the league last year. They had a very weak defensive line that had a lot of injuries. And of course, the coaches frequently put our linebackers in bad situations last year by forcing them into coverage against wide receivers. A lot of people, maybe even every single middle linebacker we've gone over in this video today, would have struggled under these unforgiving circumstances. So I decided I needed to keep looking before I came to a final verdict on Bobby Wagner in 2019. I did a little bit of searching on the internet and I came across a very interesting article on a website called Sharp Football Analysis. This article, written by John Shirley of Sports Info Solutions, is titled thus: Tackles Don't Matter, Evaluating Run Defense Through Statistics. I was immediately interested because, frankly, I've always been of the opinion that there has to be a better way to understand how a player impacts a team's run defense than just raw tackle numbers. Immediately, it was clear that this article was exactly the kind of thing I was looking for. The first couple paragraphs of the article, which I will be posting in the description, go into how, as of right now, there are not very many metrics that are used to quantify how an individual player's impacting his team's run defense. So hopefully, this article will shed some light on the Bobby Wagner question. Now, before we get underway, in the interest of transparency, I want to make one thing clear. This article was written right after Week 14 of the 2019 NFL season, meaning that all of this data only takes into account the Seahawks' first 13 games of 2019. However, if you take a look at the Seahawks' performance in run defense over those last three games, 145 yards to Carolina, 253 yards to Arizona, and 128 yards to San Francisco, it's highly unlikely including those games would do anything to help Bobby Wagner's case in these metrics. So, how does this article try to analyze an individual's contributions to their team's run defense? Well, leading off is a new statistic they've invented called tackles above expected. What are tackles above expected? The article defines them like this: uses personnel, pre-snap alignment, and intended run gap data to assign an expected tackle rate to each player on the field. We then use this tackle expectation to adjust the evaluation of each player. Confused? Let's try to simplify things with a basic example. Let's say the Seahawks and 49ers are playing a game, and the 49ers are on offense. The 49ers come out with three wide receivers, one tight end, and one running back in the backfield, and the Seahawks come out in their nickel defense with two linebackers. And let's say Bobby Wagner's on the right side. Then let's say the 49ers call a running play where Raheem Mostert takes a handoff and runs right to the right side of his offensive line behind the tackle, aka right into where Bobby Wagner is standing. This is a play where we would expect Bobby Wagner to make a tackle most of the time. The running back is running right to where he's standing, and him getting a tackle on this play is not necessarily indicative of anything overly impressive. But let's consider a second example where the teams come out in the same formation, but this time the 49ers run a pitch to Raheem Mostert to the other side of the defense. This is a play where Bobby Wagner would not necessarily be expected to make a tackle very often since the play is going away from him and there will be several Seahawks defenders who will likely have a better chance to make the tackle than him. He has to cover a much longer distance in order to get to the ball carrier. So if Bobby Wagner were to make a tackle on this play, that's something that's actually notable and impressive. So basically, your expected tackles are the number of tackles you would have been expected to make over the course of the season, given where you were and where the ball was going on every running play where you were on the field. And your tackles above expected are how many tackles you went above that expected amount. This statistic has actually been quite kind to Bobby Wagner in the past. In fact, in 2016, according to the article writer, Bobby Wagner led the entire NFL in tackles above expected. But how did he do in 2019? Well, first, let's take a look at how many run tackles Bobby Wagner got. Run tackles being how many times Bobby Wagner recorded a tackle on a designed run play by the offense. Keep in mind, again, these statistics run only through the first 13 games of the season. Bobby Wagner came in with 67 run tackles at this point in 2019, which was fifth in the NFL behind Blake Martinez, Zach Cunningham, Joe Schobert, and Eric Kendricks. But we're not so interested in knowing how many tackles Bobby Wagner had in 2019. We already know he had a lot, and it's not necessarily indicative of anything. I'm more interested in how many tackles above expected Bobby had. So let's take a look at that. The answer is 20. And this actually stacked up quite well with his peers. I could only find 3 who had more from the middle linebacker position: Zach Cunningham, Joe Schobert, and Blake Martinez. If you're curious but don't want to click on and read the article, then I'll tell you that the league leaders in tackles above expected were Zach Cunningham and Budda Baker, who both had 25. And just to provide something on the opposite side of the spectrum, we have Nick Vigil, who had an impressive 60 run tackles in 2019 to this point in the season, but it was actually a -2 tackles above expected, meaning he actually had less than the expected number of run tackles given the situations he was put in. So far so good for Bobby, right? He stacks up very well in this statistic. He's not far off from the league leaders. In fact, other than Zach Cunningham, everybody ahead of him only had one more tackle above expected. So are we in the clear? Not necessarily. So moving on to the next advanced metric in this article, we have tackle depth. Tackle depth is a pretty simple concept to understand. It simply measures how many yards a player had gained before he got tackled by that particular defender. Again, let's try to make a simple example out of it. Let's say the 49ers and Seahawks are playing a game and the 49ers have the ball. The 49ers come out, hand the ball off to Raheem Mostert on first down, and he gains 2 yards before being tackled by Bobby Wagner. Then on second down, they give the ball to Raheem Mostert again, and he gets tackled after a 4-yard gain by Bobby Wagner. After these 2 plays, Bobby Wagner's average tackle depth would be 4 plus 2 divided by 2, which equals, it's 3. Where things might get a little complicated, however, is adjusted tackle depth plus. And for an explanation of this stat, let's go to the article. Adjusted tackle depth plus uses the same principle as tackles above expected, but applies it to where on the field each tackle was made. We can estimate the average depth at which a player might make a tackle based on the personnel on the field, intended run gap, and the player's pre-snap alignment. Based on this estimate compared to where the actual tackle was made, we can calculate ADT plus, which is scaled so that 100 is average given the above factors. As an example, Redskins safety Landon Collins' 2019 ADT plus of 142 represents that his average tackle depth is 42% better than the average player given his opportunities. In short, the higher your adjusted tackle depth plus score is, the better of a job you are doing tackling ball carriers for short gains relative to the gains that you would expect them to get on the play, given all of the factors that went into setting up the play. If your ATD plus score is 100, that means you are doing an exactly average job of preventing yards on running plays. If your score is 110, you are doing 10% better than average. And if your score is 90, you are doing 10% worse than average. The league best score for ADT at this point in the 2019 season belonged to a safety, which isn't exactly surprising. Safeties have a higher degree of difficulty in making tackles in the run game. Kareem Jackson of the Denver Broncos had a sterling 158 ADT plus score. He was doing 58% better than the average at making tackles for short gains in run plays. The highest scoring linebacker was Samson Egbukam of the Los Angeles Rams, who had 150. And as near as I can tell, the highest scoring middle linebacker here is Zach Cunningham of the Texans, who had an ATD plus of 133. But before we go further into that, let's take a look at average tackle depth again. This article takes a look at some of the elite run tacklers in 2019 and takes a look at their average tackle depths. And let me just say, this is the kind of data that I really want to see go mainstream. I mean, it's just common sense that a tackle after a 2-yard gain is more valuable than a tackle after a 32-yard gain, right? These are the kinds of things that need to be in ESPN box scores. Let's make it happen. But anyway, how did some of the top middle linebackers stack up in 2019? Well, unsurprisingly, Zach Cunningham came in as by far the best. The Texan middle linebacker had an average tackle depth on run tackles of 2.7 yards. Next, Eric Kendricks, who had an average tackle depth in 2019 of 3.3 yards. And then Luke Kuechly of the Panthers, who came in at 3.4 yards. And remember, Luke Kuechly played on a run defense that was historically bad. So even in a truly awful run defense, Luke Kuechly was able to shine. Now let's move on to the more mediocre of players, Joe Schobert of the Browns. He certainly had a lot of run tackles in 2019, but his average tackle depth, which was 3.9, paints the picture of a player who was more near the middle of the league when it came to effectively stopping run plays. Next up, Blake Martinez of the Green Bay Packers, who led the league in run tackles on a run defense that was one of the worst in football. I think we all remember that NFC Championship game. So where does Blake Martinez come in here? It's not exactly pretty for him. His average tackle depth on run plays in 2019 to this point was 4.1. Maybe this explains why the Packers let him go in free agency. And now we come to our guy, Bobby Wagner. How does he stack up with these guys? How many yards did opposing teams gain on plays where Bobby Wagner made a tackle on a running back? You might want to avert your eyes for this one because, you guessed it, things do not come out looking good for old Bobby. His average tackle depth through the first 13 weeks of 2019 was 4.8. Now, full disclosure, I can't prove it and I don't have the means to prove it, but I suspect that if you stacked up Bobby Wagner's average tackle depth against every other high volume middle linebacker in the league last year, his 4.8 would be the worst, and I don't even think it would be particularly close. So let's try ADT Plus, and remember, ATD Plus's purpose is to grade these players on a curve of sorts. As I said before, Zach Cunningham is the best of this bunch with a score of 133. Next up was Luke Kuechly, who scored 119. Then Eric Kendricks of the Vikings, not far behind at 117. Joe Schobert did manage to score slightly above average with an ATD plus score of 105, and then Blake Martinez, with his poor effort, scored a 89. But where does that put Bobby? Well, this score is actually a little nicer to him than the previous one. It does seem to give him credit for his bad situations, but at the end of the day, his ATD plus score is still the worst here at 87, meaning that Bobby Wagner was 13% worse than the average run defender at preventing yards. And once again, remember that the purpose of ATD Plus is to grade players on a curve and take their situation and their teammates and opposing play calls into account. And also keep in mind that this score does not even reflect the last 3 games of the season last year in which the run defense was generally gashed every single time. Our third and final metric is run defense points saved. So what is this? The article defines it as such. When evaluating run defense, SIS's total point system takes these types of considerations into account and adds in many others, such as yards after contact, broken tackles, game situation, and more. The end result is run defense points saved, which is a single number that represents an approximation of how many points defenders have saved on designed run plays. So that certainly sounds like a very useful and interesting metric that unfortunately we will not be able to use to evaluate Bobby Wagner's play in 2019. The article does not give Bobby Wagner a score, instead opting to look at 5 other middle linebackers. I have emailed the article writer asking him if he knows what Bobby Wagner's run defense point saved score is for 2019 and have thus far not received a reply. If he ever does get back to me and tells me what I want to know, I will update the video description down below with the data he passes on. But let's take a look at the 5 middle linebackers that he did evaluate here. Remember, positive is good, negative is bad, and 0 is average. Zach Cunningham came in with 14 run defense points saved, Kendricks right behind him with 13, Luke Kuechly with 5, Joe Schobert with a -1, and Blake Martinez with a -7. So even though I can't guess what the actual number would be, based off all the data we've seen above, it seems safe to say that Bobby Wagner's run defense points saved would be in the negatives, quite possibly very deep in the negatives. But for now, we can only guess. And that's it. Those are the results of my Bobby Wagner deep dive. Most of the things I found were not pretty and confirmed a lot of the fears I had about him. But what conclusions can we draw about Bobby Wagner as a player going into his ninth season? Well, here's how I would personally put it. Bobby Wagner was a good player in 2019. You cannot average nearly 10 tackles a game like Bobby did without being good. What I am saying, however, after looking at all this data, is that Bobby Wagner was not valuable in 2019. It is not valuable to be making tackles way down the field. It is not valuable to be making tackles after you've given up a big completion in the passing game. But why didn't Bobby Wagner have value in 2019? Why did this happen? Why were some of his advanced metrics so poor? Why was he so bad in coverage? It seems to me that there are three possible reasons for this, and the likelihood is that it's a combination of all three. The question is, what percentage would you assign to each reason? One, Bobby Wagner just isn't that good anymore. Two, Bobby Wagner is being put in terrible situations by his coaches, making him look bad. Three, Bobby Wagner's teammates, most notably his defensive line, are so bad they're not allowing him to play at a high level. Draw your own conclusions and make your own verdict. But let me just say this, whatever the reason for this, we need Bobby Wagner to be good and valuable in 2020. The defensive line has been changed fairly significantly. The coaches haven't really been changed at all. So really, I'm looking at Bobby. What kind of player can Bobby Wagner still be? We're going to need something better than this in 2020 if we want to go where we want to go. This concludes my deep dive into Bobby Wagner, in which I looked at some of his 2019 shortcomings that were hidden underneath some basic and easy to obtain statistics. I hope you have all appreciated the data I put in front of you, and hopefully you can understand my concerns about Bobby Wagner going into his ninth NFL season and the 3 years remaining on his contract with the Seahawks. Thank you.